Hey, hello. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I'm Lexi Eve, and yeah, it's been a while, but welcome back to Liber Israfel. Today we're in Magic and Theory and Practice, Chapter 2, and this is the formula of the elemental weapons. So yeah, it's been a while since I uploaded a video, and I am working on another one about the 3 schools of magic, but it's taking longer than I had hoped, especially because I'm also hand-making Stele 666 at this time, so been posting pictures on Facebook. You could reach out to me on Lexi Eve on Facebook if you're interested in those. So, I'm excited to get into this. Of course, I've already covered all of the magical weapons from part 2 of Liber Israfel, but this chapter goes into using the magical wand in regard to ritual, invocation, evocation, and it mentions a couple other weapons very briefly, but let's begin. So, quote, "Most rituals are composite and contain many formulae which must be harmonized into one. The first formula is that of the wand," end quote. The shape of the wand is a straight line. It then symbolizes the fastest way between 2 points. Point A, the god is called, and point B, the god is brought down into the magician, invoked. The power of the wand is to command. All the magician need do in ceremony with the wand is point and state their will. Note, all magical weapons are aids. An experienced magi can merely use their mind, but with an apparatus such as the wand, the visual aid affects the psyche, giving a focal point to put all their attention upon. The spark of light seen coming out of the tip of the wand is symbolic of the phoenix. It is astral light extended from the mind through the wand, and there the astral light is directed and morphed into innumerable shapes and symbols. Quote, "It will be seen that this is a formula rather of evocation than of invocation, and for the latter, the procedure, though apparently the same, should be conceived of in a different manner, which brings it under another formula, that of Tetragrammaton. The essence of the force invoked is one, but the god represents the germ or beginning of the force, the archangel is development, and so on, until with the spirit we have the completion and perfection of that force," end quote. This is just a fascinating bit of TID that I wanted to quote, as it gives clear insight into the formula of creation through spiritual evolution. The wand in this chapter is Yod of Tetragrammaton. Yod is, by its shape, symbolic of the seed, spermatozoon. Yod is fire, like the astral light is fire. God then is the seed or germ, which impregnates the He of Tetragrammaton and becomes the Elohim, angels. After all, the power of magic is that of creation, so knowing this lends power to the magician in regards to how one should aim their magic. Now, Crowley continues by stating, quote, "The formula of the cup is not so well suited for evocations, and the magical hierarchy is not involved in the same way. For the cup being passive rather than active, it is not fitting for the magician to use it in respect of anything but the highest. In practical working, it consequently means little but prayer," end quote. Essentially, the cup can only hold what one pours into it, and then generally one consumes it. A footnote in this chapter refers the reader to Liber 81 Moonchild. In this story, a woman meets the adepts of the Great White Brotherhood, and she becomes a vehicle for a child, born via a massive operation under the planetary influence of Luna. In this case, she is acting as the cup, and a homunculus is being bred within her via a ton of orisons of magi all focused on the moon and birthing an avatar of Luna. In this case, yes, the cup is suitable for invocation, evocation, and in general, during ceremonies that focus on transubstantiation, turning wine into blood of Babylon or of the saints, the cup has its purpose, but I'll digress, as it is a passive weapon, as Crowley stated. So we move on to the dagger and pentacle, which is, quote, "unsuitable for either purpose, since the nature of the dagger is to criticize, to destroy, to disperse. The formula of the pentacle is again of no particular use, for the pentacle is inert. In fine, the formula of the wand is the only one which we need more particularly concern ourselves," end quote. Why Crowley took us down this rabbit hole in this chapter is beyond me, but for the remainder of the chapter, what we are discussing is the wand in regards to invocation or evocation. To paraphrase, one can simply call to the deity and beg it to come. One could, quote, harmonize themselves with the nature of the god and to a certain extent exalt themselves in the course of the ceremony, end quote. Or better yet, one can seek, quote, real identification of the magician with the god, end quote, but this requires the attainment of samadhi. So I hope you have been working on your Liber E and prerequisites that lead to Dharana thus far. To do this, firstly, one must study as much as possible about the deity. You must know its appearance, mythology, its symbolism, its personality, everything about it, quote, so that a perfectly clear and unshakable mental picture of the god is presented to the mind. Similarly, the attributes of the god are enshrined in speech, and such speeches are committed perfectly to memory. The invocation will then begin with a prayer to the god, commemorating his physical attributes, always with profound understanding of their real meaning, end quote. So in ritual, let's say you're constructing your own to invoke a god. It begins by describing its physical and maybe some personality attributes. Quote, in the second part of the invocation, the voice of the god is heard, and his characteristic utterance is recited. In the third portion of the invocation, the magician asserts the identity of himself with the god. In the fourth portion, the god is again invoked, but as if by himself, as if it were the utterance of the will of the god that he should manifest in the magician. At the conclusion of this, the original object of the invocation is stated, end quote. So it's basically a process of perfect identification with the deity. Your mind should take a back seat, and you should feel the presence of the deity working through you. Crowley uses Liber Israfel as an example. I have myself gone over Liber Israfel in full in another video, but if you want to see how Crowley identifies the 4 parts of invocation, you can press pause now and see which verse begins which part. Quote, the Egyptian gods are so complete in their nature, so perfectly spiritual, and yet so perfectly material, that this one invocation is sufficient. The god bethinks him that the spirit of Mercury should now appear to the magician, and it is so, end quote. Crowley identifies another formula with Liber Israfel, and it applies to many invocations. And he coined it, quote, the formula of Horus and Harpocrates, end quote. Essentially, one calls outward to the deity by sheer will. This is Horus, much like the sign of the Emperor. Then, the magician becomes passive and takes the god in. This is Harpocrates, much like the sign of silence. We had covered much of this in previous chapters, but I'm sure this will be the first video somebody clicks on my channel, so just bear with us. The formula of Tetragrammaton is aptly applied to this ritual, and I'm just going to give a brief overview as the next chapter goes into Tetragrammaton in full, so we'll be discussing it in the next video. Now, I suggest learning the formula of Tetragrammaton for invocation, especially if you plan on constructing your own invocations, as it is a quite useful tool. For Yod, fire, quote, the magician prays eagerly, end quote. For He, water, the, quote, magician listens to or catches the reflection of the god, end quote. For Vav, air, quote, the marriage of fire and water, the god and the man have become one, end quote. And for He, final earth, quote, the condensation or materialization of those 3 higher principles, end quote, i.e., the god manifests fully within the magician and union occurs. Crowley writes about the immaterial of such beings, and the arguments which have indeed taken place years past about how if 2 people call the same entity at the same time, how can it be in 2 places at once? Of course, the answer is that all of this is merely taking place in the mind. The entity called is a representation of an all-pervasive construct, such as the light or one of the planets and their energy that's literally everywhere. But an important fact about invocation is that, quote, the mind is the great enemy. So by invoking enthusiastically a person whom we know not to exist, we are rebuking the mind, end quote. Now, I find it funny that such debates about incorporeal entities have occurred. The past magical practitioners wrote into their conjuration such devices, quote, which tell the spirit that if he happens to be in chains in a particular place in hell, or if some other magician is conjuring him so that he cannot come, then let him send a spirit of similar nature, or otherwise avoid the difficulty, end quote. Now, this is not to say that deities and spirits do not exist. They exist as much as you or I exist. are as real and as false as anything in the universe is real or false, but they are all governed by different laws, and the mind trying to grasp that which is beyond it often comes up with absurdities that must be overcome or transcended. When we start applying human laws, such as a person cannot be two places at once, to spiritual energy, it starts to get wonky. And so hopefully we're working towards transcending old Aeonic, patriarchal ideologies of spirituality and magic. And all that to say, magic works. The forces which lie behind such entities certainly have real effects on the magician. In fact, Crowley closes this chapter with an example. He recited to a novice Sappho's Ode to Venus. The student knew little to nothing about such things, being but a probationer. Yet, when then guiding on an astral travel right after, quote, everything seen by him was without exception harmonious with Venus. This was true down to the smallest detail. He even obtained all 4 color scales of Venus with absolute correctness. Considering that he saw something like 100 symbols in all, the odds against coincidence are incalculably great, end quote. Thus we end this chapter, and Crowley's final remarks are that the invocations and conjurations passed down to us are in many cases coming from minds that had put outdated ideologies together, and, quote, are but the ruins of the temple of magic, end quote. So there is much to discuss ahead, and I will see you in the next video where we're going to go into the formula of Tetragrammaton in much greater detail. Love is the law, love under will. I'll see you all in the next one.